Yeah, I did have an experience a few years ago that has perhaps offered me a new perspective on educating lawyers. And that is that I was a client in a pretty contentious litigation where I was the named plaintiff. It was a discrimination lawsuit. And what was interesting about that was that I had been represented by lawyers before in fairly routine matters, writing a will, closing a house, those kinds of things. Most of those not particularly difficult situations, but this was the first time that I had had the experience of being represented by someone in a situation of conflict, in a situation that was difficult and contentious, and even, had the potential of overtaking my life for a few years, as it turned out. And so it was very interesting when I learned about being a lawyer from the experience of being a client. One of the things that really struck me was how often lawyers, in particular legal educators, talk about the client, what the client wants, what the client needs, when the client is never a part of those conversations. And so one of the things I learned is that I think we make a lot of assumptions about a standardized client in preparing students to become lawyers. And one of the things that we assume is that the client is either most focused on avoiding liability or maximizing compensation. And we don't really prepare students for the whole range of emotions and needs that clients experience. Because I saw firsthand what that range of needs was. And one of the things that I realized I needed from my lawyer was that, of course, I needed legal knowledge and I needed legal skills. I wanted somebody who was competent and who was effective. But that I really needed somebody who was going to help me come through a period of difficulty, a period of even crisis in my life, come through that with my integrity in place and feeling whole and able to move on after the conflict was over. And so that really required a lawyer taking the time to know who I was, to understand what my values were and what my goals were. The lawyer had to understand, among other things, the way in which many of my important relationships were being affected by the litigation, by the conflict. And the lawyer needed to help me act out of the best of who I was instead of sometimes acting out of the worst of who I was in those moments of difficulty. I learned too that conflict and adversarialism can even encourage you sometimes to act out of those worst motives. And so in retrospect, now that that's over and I've moved on from that, I did learn that it was very helpful to have a lawyer who sometimes would even challenge me and say, are you sure that's really what you want to do? I'm not sure you're going to be happy with that when you look back on it in 6 months or later, or I'm not sure that that particular action right now would meet your goals. And so one of the things that I learned from that, I think, is that I needed a lawyer who could see me as a whole person in the midst of that representation, and that required a lawyer who was a whole person himself. And so I think that's a challenge for educators, is to understand that we have an obligation to prepare our students to be whole in their lives as lawyers, and that will benefit not only them, but will benefit their clients as well, because until they're able to be whole, they're probably not able really to interact with their clients in that way that's most helpful to the client. One of my favorite books is Parker Palmer's book, The Courage to Teach, which is about teaching, and one of the points that he makes in that book is that to be a good teacher is much more than technique or knowledge, that it's really about bringing all of who you are into the classroom and meeting your students that way. That carries with it a responsibility to continue to work on who you are and to continue to improve, but that if you do that you'll probably be a good teacher regardless of which techniques you choose or which subjects you teach. And I think that's the same for all professionals, really. We need to be able to be whole in what we do so that we can help our clients be whole at the end of whatever brought them to us in the first place. One of the things that I learned through that experience was how vulnerable you feel as a client as well. And I had talked with my students about that beforehand, but it had been a little more theoretical. before, but for me it was a real moment of crisis when I found out I needed somebody else to help solve my problems, because I was pretty good at solving my problems myself up until then. And so I think recognizing that as professionals you're often dealing with people at those real moments of vulnerability is important too. And we need to do more, I believe, to get the client's voice into legal education so that students have a more complete picture of who their clients are likely to be and what their clients really need from them than we offer just by using a casebook where the client's described as plaintiff and defendant or landlord and tenant or whatever the descriptive term is that we use. Steve Kivas had a large influence on me and my understanding of lawyers and what we could be doing in legal education, and he's had a huge influence on many of my students as well. Steve and I actually team taught a course several times when I was teaching in Texas. He was there by phone part of the time and then actually was present in the classroom with students for some of the time. I think Steve is such a wonderful storyteller, and what he does is he tells the stories of lawyers who have gone through changes in their own careers, who have decided that they want their practices to be meaningful and have found ways to make their practices meaningful. His book, Transforming Practices, is one that I've used as a text for some of the courses that I've taught, and then I've also given it as gifts to lawyers that I know, or to students who want to become lawyers, or students who are graduating and becoming lawyers. What I really like about the book, Transforming Practices, is its variety. Steve's a wonderful storyteller, and he tells the stories of a variety of lawyers so that almost everybody who's read the book finds somebody in the book that they can identify with. Not everybody. Often they'll tell you, you know, there was one chapter that I really liked and another chapter that I didn't like. But I think the way in which he focuses on the changes that people can make in their lives to make a real difference is important. I think a lot of lawyers don't feel that they really control their lives. And the work that Steve has done, I think, shows examples of lawyers who've taken control of their lives, who've decided to practice law in a different way, to have different kind of relationships with their clients, and that's very good modeling for students and for lawyers.